The third episode of the new Disney Gallery Mandalorian documentary is out now. It's all about our three main human cast members, that's Pedro Pascal, Gina Carano, and Carl Weathers. And I'm going to break it down after the intro. Well, hello there. My name's Jeremy and welcome back to Freeform Disney, where I talk about all aspects of Disney, from the animated movies to the theme parks to Star Wars, Marvel, and Pixar, and the TV shows, and everything else in between. And that is why it's Freeform. And keep coming back every day for new daily content. If you're not subscribed yet, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Well, I hope the force is with everyone today. It certainly was with this episode, which I think is the strongest overall episode of the season so far. It's also the most fun. The cast is both hilarious and touching. This is the third episode of the new Disney Gallery show, and it's fittingly called Cast. And it's focused on the three big human cast members. And that does make me wonder when we'll focus on Baby Yoda, or should I say the child? I can't imagine the show is not going to focus on him at some point, so somewhere in these remaining 5 episodes, we've got to see him. I mean, the episode titles for those 5 are Technology, Practical, Visualization, Score, and Connections. So I'm not really sure where that's going to fit in there. Maybe over in Practical? I mean, certainly a practical effect. And again, I can't imagine they'll leave him out entirely. So it looks like we'll probably got another couple episodes till we see Baby Yoda make his appearance over here in our Disney Gallery show. Well, anyway, back to the episode. As predicted, we had another new table, and this time it was with the cast members. Although we didn't have a 6-person table, it was a 5-person table this time. So Jon Favreau was hosting, as usual, with Dave Filoni over by his side, again, as usual. And then we had Carl Weathers, who played Greef Karga in the show, Pedro Pascal, who played Mando, and Gina Carano, who played Cara Dune. And I will say, I kind of wish that it had been a 6-person table, because I was hoping to see Giancarlo Esposito at it as well. He's the one who played Moff Gideon, by the way. Although, if they had done that, they definitely would have needed a longer episode, as I wouldn't have wanted to take away any time from the other 3 cast members. The episode and its length worked really well as it was. Now, that said, we did see some of the directors back from the first episode, although they weren't in it too much. And as for last week's table, we didn't see them at all in this episode. I'm sure we'll be seeing them some more later. Oh, and by the way, if you haven't seen my videos for either of those 2 episodes, you can catch them up in the top right corner or down below in the description. Well, there was one other surprise addition to our ever-growing Mandalorian documentary universe. And that was Kim Richards, who was first assistant director for most of the episodes to season 1, and she made a brief appearance in this episode. I do wonder what her table will look like. Probably a bunch of the other crew members, I'm guessing, higher up positions. I'm guessing we'll finally see that table, say, in Practical or the Visualization episode. Well, anywho, with all that said, let's jump on in. Here's what went down in the episode. There were 4 main sections in the episode. First, we kind of had an overall section, and we were talking about the design of Mandalorian and the tricks that made for acting. Then we went over into Pedro Pascal, Gina Carano, and then Carl Weathers. To start off, Pedro Pascal goes ahead and talks about how important relationships and characters are in a show. And they really are. As much as there may be plots or cool explosions or special effects or story, well, really, even in story, it's about those relationships. That's why we really get drawn in. If we don't connect to the characters, it doesn't really matter how cool the plot is or how cool the story is outside of the characters. Who cares? And intriguingly, we notice things like plot holes a heck of a lot more when we don't connect to the characters, and we're a lot more forgiving when we do. Well, jumping back to the episode, Carl Weathers had this really interesting piece that he said over in the beginning when he was talking to Jon Favreau. He was talking about how, of course, he was interested in working with Jon, but, he really needs to see the script. And the reason why Carl Weathers really cares about the script is, as he says, I want to know what I'm being asked to do. Because people have their agendas or they have their ways of seeing the world. As an actor, what you are really doing is you're somehow endorsing what someone wants to say about the world or in the world. So that's what Carl Weathers said, and dang, yeah, no kidding, he's right. Now, not all actors are in a place where they can just choose to reject a script because they don't agree with the message. But certainly for those who are, yeah, there are all kinds of agendas and all kinds of things people want to say. Frankly, it doesn't matter what we're talking about. No matter what the creative medium, yes, there are things being said. There are worldviews being promoted, even if it's not even a conscious effort. That's just what we do. The very way I view the world, if I'm telling someone else something, is projecting my own worldview. Now, part of the trick sometimes in creating a story really is making it so it doesn't feel like you're pushing your worldview on someone else, right? And we get that. And then we really started talking about the style of The Mandalorian, which, unsurprisingly, was noted as being inherited from George Lucas, who created the Mandalorian style in the first place when it came to Empire Strikes Back, and then later Return of the Jedi. And Jon Favreau called it the deconstructed gunfighter iconography. Kind of based on the man with no name. You've got the brim of the hat in the armor. It's a really neat way of looking at it. Really cool. Yeah, I agree. Pedro Pascal went ahead and associated with how everyone's covered in their own armor and how he wants to make the character as relatable as possible. It's interesting how we find these little bits of truth, just in the characters and how we work to identify with them and make them identifiable to the audience. And how do you act as the Mandalorian in order to make sure people understand what you're saying? How do you direct somebody to act when you're, say, Deborah Chow or Rick Famuyiwa to make sure that people can actually get something out of that performance? Well, one of the interesting things is rather than doing more, making bigger motions or bigger effects, actually for Mando, it's kind of the opposite. It's stillness. Make it so he doesn't move much. That way, even those small gestures are really meaningful, so you can read a lot into it. And also that stillness really plays into his character and who he is. So definitely nicely played. A very good job to the directors and, of course, to Pedro in terms of how that character is played. And that was all before we actually start talking about Pedro Pascal specifically, because the next section is that. And we start off with this great story, a hilarious story. Although, it also has some blood involved in it. But this was apparently Pedro Pascal's first trip to the hospital when he was actually going there from a set. Somehow he's gotten away with all kinds of dangerous acting, never had to go to a hospital. He even commented on the hot tin roofs out in South America one time, where he felt that one little slip and he'd be done for the rest of his life. So what happened on the Mando set? Well, he was in the makeup trailer, getting ready for that episode where we finally see his face all bloody and covered. Well, and so he's not looking exactly where he's going in. He walks into a piece of plywood. Of all the ways to finally get injured, when you've been in dangerous situations everywhere, that's what happens. And so they rush him off to the emergency room. And of course, the emergency room staff, they're like, let him in. As Pedro Pascal says, this guy's at death's door. Because he's covered in blood for the, makeup blood for the scene coming up. Now, that said, he did actually need 7 stitches to his nose for that injury right there. So he had some of his own real blood up on his face. But hey, as Dave Filoni said, what really is just Pedro Pascal is a really method actor. He just had to really get in character and feel how injured his character was really supposed to be, right? The way the story was told, great little story. Carl Weathers really got into a piece talking about just how tricky it was acting with somebody covered in a face helmet like that. Just how you usually get all these nonverbal cues off someone or be able to see it in their eyes, and you don't get that with Mando. You are pretty much focusing in on that voice. That's all you're really getting. And so we talked about how you had to get so still and you concentrate that much more just to get anything out of that voice. So a really neat piece in talking about the acting and talking about what it's like to act against that. I think that would be a fun acting job myself. Now here's a question for you. I didn't look into a whole lot of behind the scenes stuff on Mandalorian prior to this, so I'm not aware of much of that. Maybe some of you are? If so, you already know this, but here's the question. When we talk about who plays Mando, what's the answer to that? Is it Pedro Pascal? Well, not quite. There are actually 3 Mandos, shall we say. There's Pedro Pascal, Brendan Wayne, and Lateef Crowder. And as Pedro Pascal says, he's modeling his performance around their physicality in a number of ways because they do a lot of the work, which is kind of a neat advantage you have with a character that is completely covered head to toe who you don't see the face of. with very, very rare exception, of course. Well, Brendan Wayne is the big gunslinger, so he's got all of that aspect for fighting for Mando. And then Lateef knows all kinds of different martial arts, jujitsu, etc. And he's always training, always learning. And so when it comes to those kind of pieces, that's all Lateef right there. And it was really interesting hearing Gina Carano talking about having like a connection with all three of those people and viewing them kind of as one person, one Mandalorian. Speaking of tricky acting things, that sounds like it could be in its own right too, especially when you do notice some of the differences between the three. And one last thing while we're talking about Pedro Pascal, they talked about voiceover work and how they would actually do lots of improvising. They would do rewriting on the spot and finessing. And that's clever. It gives all kinds of ability to rework things after the fact, after you've gone through the days of recording. So you can go ahead and fine tune it, make it so the show works that much better than it was going to already. Maybe you think that whatever's going on, it just wasn't carried out well enough through Mando and the voice. Well, guess what? Change it a little bit. You have the ability to do it because no one can see your mouth move anyway. Love it. I mean, it's obvious, but I didn't really think about just how much re-recording they might do over the voice. And apparently they do an impressive amount. And that was really like Pedro Pascal, Jon Favreau, and Dave Filoni just working together. And there's some great behind the scenes footage of the three of them working. Love the cleverness. Okay, then we get to talking about Gina Carano, who plays Cara Dune. Now, we talked about a few different things. First, we started talking really about her initial casting, because she was cast quite interestingly. She didn't actually go through a whole audition process or anything else. No. Jon Favreau especially saw her work in like Haywire and Deadpool, Steven Soderbergh's work, and thought, well, she would be good for this part. And essentially, she got the phone call saying, hey, would you like to do that? And well, obviously she accepted. These interesting stories about how she was over in some of the early story illustrations when he had his first meeting with Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni. Apparently before she might have even been cast in the part, they were already starting to put her in the artwork because they were that sure on who the heck they wanted. And hey, even if Gina Carano doesn't feel like a regular actress or that she's ever going to be very Hollywood, well, certainly ain't gonna hear me complain. She did one hell of a job in this role. Loved every bit of it. Alright, so then we talked about her physicality, and very much so. She commented on how for that job she was physically herself, how she thought that it really was the first time that she's genuinely gotten into a character. And there was a touching piece where she talked about how really through this acting bit, that it really helped her to learn to love who she was in terms of her own physicality and being able to do that. Oh, and there was some neat talk about the scene where she has to pick up Mando and essentially just drag him over into that common house, and how it really made people realize just how strong she was. There was no stunt double for that or anything else. No. She just picked him up and dragged him, armor and all. Which also, by the way, is where Kim Richards, our first assistant director, got her quick little piece in there, talking about how she finds it awesome being a young woman in the industry, getting to see other women being portrayed on a really heroic, badass light. Definitely a great example. And an interesting thing when talking about Gina Carano's performance is how real it is. She had years as a fighter. She knows what it's like to get punched. She knows what it's like to give punches. She knows what that really feels like. Therefore, she can act what it really feels like. That gives you that human vulnerability. Rather than trying to fake it all, you can actually draw on something that you really have within your own experience. And that's always the best acting, when you actually have something real to draw upon. And closing out her section, we had this really neat interchange between her and Carl Weathers. It was our way of transitioning over to his section. She was telling this whole story about how Jon Favreau told her and would help give her some pointers by telling her to watch Carl Weathers. Because guess what? He's a superstar. Just watch what he's doing. And this story, as she kept going, talking about how his voice is so powerful and so beautiful, it just sounds like a song and everyone can hear it in the room. And we all looked around and thought to ourselves, that is a superstar. Really, you could tell everyone in the room agreed with her on that. And Carl Weathers' response, he's taken aback a little bit and takes it Carl Weathers-y, shall we say. Good Lord. Thank you, Gina. Man, it would be cool to act opposite Carl Weathers. I mean, dang, that just would be fun. With that said, let's talk about Carl Weathers and Greef Karga, his character. When Jon Favreau first approached Carl Weathers for this part, well, Jon Favreau said, it was just a favor, come in, just do this one. And they were originally planning on really just bringing him in the first episode and killing him off in the third. That was the original plan. Because bear in mind, Carl Weathers doesn't do much acting, hasn't for a while. So this isn't his typical to pop in. And, well, Carl Weathers went ahead and accepted to do it as a favor. But here's some more fun. Originally, they were looking at his character being an alien, full prosthetics, you wouldn't even see his face. And this comes to another great fun story. Because after they brought Carl Weathers in, between Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau, they're kind of going to each other, how the heck can we cover his face with a prosthetic? I mean, we've got to be able to see Carl Weathers. And Jon Favreau then has this little story where he says, and he told Carl, we can't cover you up. And Carl Weathers responded, I figured as much. Just the deadpan response and reaction. And you actually get Carl Weathers reacting to the story at the table as well. And that's definitely Carl Weathers for you. I mean, everyone gets in on that one too. And yeah. Oh, listen, it was a good section. Too much fun. Too much fun. And to close out that whole episode, well, we have this neat little talk about really the importance of actors. We have the section of where we had Dave Filoni talking about a test screening they were doing early on and the difficulty they were having with, well, the mass, part of where they got rid of some of those massive aliens. And he's just going, I could draw this so much faster. Why am I doing this? Oh, and there was a cute little thing where he calls Jon Favreau Coach, bringing in Coach to go ahead and do it. But anyway, they had problems getting Mando to be able to even sit in the booth. I mean, in fairness, they also improved the suit of armor afterward later too. But the real important point was once they finally did get there and they got Pedro Pascal in the costume, it was just like butter. And it was easy at that point. And there's an importance there, as Jon Favreau points out. It's not just putting people in there and trying to work them around. It's that you need actors in those costumes. Actors become those characters. Those costumes then are part of who they are. And they know how to move in them in a way that toss a random person in there and they just don't know how to move in that in the same way. That was a really neat statement, and I get that. I definitely get that. But even as much as we get that, it can still surprise us. Heck, you can't tell me that Jon Favreau, who's directed how many people, etc., doesn't get that. And yet even so, it still catches you. You do the test screening and you're still like, until you actually get the actor in the costume. Which, by the way, also says, we all still have stuff to learn. And even when we learn it, it helps to get reminders. Hey, actors are amazing. And I don't just say that because I've been an actor so much. I mean, love actors. Well, anyway, this episode held my attention super well all the way throughout. And really, it pulls you straight on through. It had great momentum, and it felt like the shortest episode in many ways, simply because, for me, I just end up surprised when it's already over. I'm like, whoa, that was it? Wow. And frankly, that's a great thing. It was also the funniest episode of the three so far, and had the most touching moments. There were a number of those in there. And watching the cast when they were in the interviews around the table, you get a lot more emotion on their faces than you do, say, for the table with the directors or the other table that had more of the production side and special effects. You just don't get as much across their faces. By the way, if you haven't had the chance to see that episode of the Disney Gallery Mandalorian, the one on the cast here that we're talking about, go take a look at it. It's definitely worth checking out. Well, with that being done, now it's time to wait for next week's episode, Technology. And I'll definitely be back to go ahead and talk about it with you next week. Looking forward to that. And so it's that time of the episode where I say, well, what about you? What did you think of this episode of Disney Gallery? How much did you laugh during it? Let me know down below in the comments. And thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please give it a like, share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe. And come back tomorrow for another new episode of Freeform Disney. Have a magical day, and may the Force be with you always.